Starting the recording now. Hi, my name is Oliver, and I am making a brief screencast about a crash course in Blender. I'm actually going to be doing a small presentation at my company tomorrow, where I give basically the same talk to a bunch of people, and I thought it'd be a good idea to practice and just go through the steps that I've kind of thought that I'm going to be doing in the talk tomorrow, and may as well record a screencast at the same time in case it's helpful for anyone. So basic agenda is we're going to be doing some very simple stuff in Blender. It's a bit of a crash course in how to use the basics, and what we'll end up with is some kind of a 3D printable, well, hopefully 3D printable object, like a Brio train track, I guess, joining segment or something like this. It's a bit of an artificial contrived example, but idea came from someone else at work here who was interested in creating something similar. And so, yeah, let's just try and create it and see what happens. It may actually not be 3D printable at all, but you know, the basic principles are still there, and maybe it'll be useful for you, and you can kind of extend it. So let me see, what is the agenda? So that's basically what we're aiming for. We're going to go through like the screen layout, talk about some of the parts of how Blender works, the shelves, the navigation, how we can kind of use the basic manipulations of different objects, with scaling, movement, rotation, etc. We're going to start decomposing, or like, well, not decomposing exactly, but we're going to start making some manipulations to this cube that we have on the screen, using some of the modifiers, having a basic look at rendering, although that's obviously not very interesting for 3D printing, and then adding a simple texture to it. Again, not really useful for 3D printing, but good to see what it might actually look like, and then exporting to an STL file. So let's just jump in straight away. So we're in Blender. I'm using 2.78a. First thing to kind of note is that it's an extremely complicated interface, at least on first glance, and until you get really comfortable with it. There's a lot of stuff going on. And the first thing you probably do is try and click around in here, and then you suddenly realize, oh, actually this doesn't really do what I expect. I'm just left clicking and nothing's really happening. And if you actually manage to get it to move around a little bit, then you know that's about as successful as you can be. But otherwise, it's kind of a little bit underwhelming. First thing you can do, if you really just want to like get the basics done and get some kind of feedback on what's going on, you can just go up to here and go render image, and then you at least see something, right? So let me just check that I can see my key presses here. I can't. That's a problem. Let's make sure that I've got my visualize going on. Okay, so escape. Okay, so we're back. I've got a little program called Visualize running, so you can see what I'm pressing, because there's a lot of shortcuts. So, general thing to be aware of. And I can't make these any bigger, unfortunately. Most of these, some of these panes you can actually zoom in on a little bit. You can see I can zoom in and out of that, but that's not particularly useful. So, a lot of stuff going on here. Let me just get rid of these two things for the moment. Basic thing to be aware of, all of these different sections are more or less the same. They're just operating in different modes. So this thing over here is running the outliner. Let me just move this across a little bit. This is running the outliner, which is, where is it, over here? This one, but it could just as well be another 3D view. And now I've made that a little bit hard to use. This thing up here, which kind of looks like a standard sort of menu, is actually, if you increase it, it's actually the console output, or the info panel, which happens to have some Python stuff going on as well. This one here is just a 3D view. I should actually say I've got a slightly different layout to normal. Where is it? That's not it. I think, is that the default one? There's usually another thing down here which I've gotten rid of for my default settings, which is the timeline view. Now that's not going to work too well if I do that. So yours might look a little bit different, but what you can do is you can just customize this completely to your own tastes. I'm not going to go too deep into it. You might see some of these little thingies at the top of each of these panes. This allows you to create new ones. And you can very easily get yourself into a lot of trouble like this, where they just start multiplying. And at least you can set these to different things, right? That one might be a timeline. Most often you might have it as an image editor. If you want to get rid of these, you just, again, click on this thing, drag it over. You can kind of see in the middle here, around about here, there's a little arrow. You can see where it's going to move into it and get rid of the other one. So these are just being merged. If you want to actually get rid of the one on the left, then you can actually go over to the right and then go back left. And you can see that the arrow shows you which one is going to be destroyed. In this case, they're the same, so it doesn't really matter. So this might be two ways of having a look at what's going on in the render, and one which is the 3D view. You might also want to have two different 3D views, but this one might actually be an orthographic view of the same object. Unfortunately, they're not synchronized in their rotation and zoom level like you might find in Unreal Engine, but this might be useful. You can see as you move stuff around, etc. Anyway, I'm not going to use that for the moment, so let's just put it back to the 3D view. Right, so what else have we got? The tools and properties shelves. These are parts of the 3D view panel. Press T if the tool shelf is gone, and somewhat confusingly press N for the properties shelf. Not too important to know what's going on in here, and there are a lot of different sections. Main thing I would say is that this tends to contain, the properties shelf tends to contain stuff that's going on about this particular thing you've got selected at the moment. Some other stuff like the grid, the 3D cursor. It's got some things that can help you understand when you've got surfaces that are going to be kind of, I don't actually know how to describe it. When you've got a square that's going to be, or a quad that's going to be split up into two triangles, you can have it mark out that in the display so you can see what's going on at a lower level. Various things which most of the time I don't actually use. So I'll forget about that for the moment. And then this one is all about, there's a bunch of things which are like transformation tools, some shortcuts for creating different objects, and then this part of the pane down here which kind of changes between different things depending on your context. But if you create a new object, you can set some initial settings over here of that, so that can be very useful. Then I would say the next thing we should talk about is how we actually get around in this interface. So let's not worry about this 3D cursor over here for the moment. We'll deal with that later. In fact, we may not even need to deal with it at all in the next few minutes. This is the object that we have selected. We can rotate around it, and unfortunately you can't see my mouse movements, but using either, well, I'm using two fingers on the touchpad here to just move around it. This kind of, you can rotate in all of the different axes being X on the red, Y on the green, and blue Z, which you can also see down here, just to give you to remember which one is which. Movement, well, I've got basically I'm rotating at the moment, but if I hold down Shift, I can also go up and down in the Z axis, or I can go left and right, which is kind of in my, I guess, well, local X or Y axis, depending on how you think about it. What else is there? Zoom, if I hold down Control, again with the two fingers, zooming in and out with the two fingers on the trackpad, or I guess it might be a mouse wheel. I'm not entirely sure what happens when you do it with a real mouse. Yes, and then I guess The next thing we should talk about is this thing that we're trying to build. It's very important at this point, before you build something, if you're going to try and build something which is like based off a real object, you need to know what it looks like, obviously. Might seem like an obvious statement, but it really helps also to set the scale of what you're building. So right now you can see that we've got this grid here, and this is based on Blender units. I'm not going to go too deeply into what they are. They're completely artificial, and they're only something which is local to Blender. But if you start thinking about printing something in the real world, then you have to very much consider what do these actually convert to in the real world. So one of these Blender units is one of these kind of square-ish things here. And this cube, well, let's see, if we go to the top of it, and it's a little bit hard to see in perspective view, but if we go to orthographic view, you can see that it's 2 by 2 by 2 Blender units. I think most of the time if you export to STL and you print something, one Blender unit ends up being 1 millimeter, which is incredibly small. We can also see this in the properties shelf. We've got the dimensions here. X is 2, Y is 2, Z is 2. We can set this to 1 by 1 by 1 if we want, and then it's a lot smaller. Let's just go back to perspective so we can zoom in on it. And then it's inconveniently in the right in the center of everything, and it's not aligned with the whole units anymore. Scale is kind of like just another representation of the dimensions, so you can kind of multiply by whole numbers and not have to worry about the actual size. And I should say I'm going to be completely ignoring the real world units, maybe up until the very last moment, because you can actually scale it up when you export it. So let's have a look at what this thing might look like. Let's see, Brio train track. I'll show you briefly what this might look like. Images. Hopefully we don't get anything that's a little bit suspicious. So this. I'm going to try and create something that's kind of like the opposite of this, right? This has got 2 ends on it, which is less interesting from a Blender perspective, at least what I'm going to show. I'm going to try and create the opposite, where we've actually got the 2 indentations like this one on each side. So we can kind of, well, I guess it's a bit like this kind of intersection thing, but with just these gaps and a straight piece. So that's kind of what we're going for here. Let's go back to Blender. And yeah, then let's talk about how do we actually manipulate this in a very simple way. So for starters, I'm going to get rid of that shelf. I'm going to turn off snapping, which is, well, we won't really talk about that. I think it's not so useful at the moment. How can we scale, how can we manipulate this cube that we already have? And I should just draw your attention, it's up here. In the outliner, this is where all of the different objects in this world are. And it's the cube. We only have one of them, very simple, and it's got a mesh, which is the actual geometry, i.e. the vertices at the corners, the lines on the side, or the edges, and then the actual faces that are between these edges and vertices. So it's a very simple cube. What if we, if we were going to try and make some track out of this? Well, for starters, it's kind of really centered in the very center of the Earth, so of this world. So half of it is hanging below this plane. It's not too much of an issue, but maybe I want to put it above the plane. So actually what I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab it with G, and this is for general movement, and then I want to move it in the Z axis, so I can lock it to Z, and I want to move it up by 1. Actually, no, I don't. 0.5, because it's, at this point, was it a 1 by 1? Yeah, it's a 1 by 1 by 1 cube right now. So it was hanging half below the plane here, so I need to move it up by 0.5. That's really useful. I can, of course, just click on these things and drag it around, but it's much less precise. And just revert those things. A lot of other 3D editors will basically, like Unreal Engine, for example, you can basically only do that. You can only manipulate using the mouse, which I don't find very nice. I think, it helps to be very precise, and for that, using keyboard shortcuts is the best thing. So using, again, grab let's move it in the x-axis now. So you can see exactly where it's going to be going, and it'll even let you move it yourself. But if I start typing a number, maybe 1, it's going to move it in the positive direction 1 unit there. And I could decide at this point, and you can see what it's doing, by the way, just, oops, not there. I'm still in the movement mode. Let me just change this for a second. So if I revert that by pressing escape, well, now it's gone, I can't show you. If you look down in the left corner while I'm doing this, grab X, you will see in the bottom left corner, we've got where it's moving along the global X. And we will probably not worry too much about global versus local, which you can see the difference there. But it's basically these will be different depending on the orientation of the object. So let's not worry about that for the moment. But we could grab it in the X, move it 1, or we could move it -1, and you can change if you want. Or moving in the Y, 1, -1, etc. Right, so that's kind of most of movement. Let's talk about scaling it. Actually, let's talk about rotating it. Rotating it, keyboard shortcut is R. And if we don't do anything else, then we get a very confusing kind of tool, and it's rotating in an axis that I'm not really sure which axis it is, but it's basically relative to the viewpoint of the camera. So it's relative to us where we're looking at it from. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. Again, we can rotate in the Z-axis, which is up and down, so that allows us to kind of spin it, or the X-axis, which is, as I said, well, that red line there, and then it's always rotating around the axis you choose, or the Y-axis. And again, we can give it a specific number. So 90 degrees is not going to look like very much because it's a cube. 45 degrees, and now it's of course locked, or maybe 30 degrees, -30 degrees, etc. That's pretty much it. You can, actually, there's a way of doing this, there's a way of getting to a different rotation mode with another keyboard shortcut, but I've completely forgotten it. Anyway, that's most of what is useful. Then scaling, changing the size of this object, you get to with S. Now again, it's kind of scaling based on where we're looking at it from, which is a general, well, right now it's actually scaling, no, that's not true at all. It's scaling in every single different dimension at the same rate. So this may or may not be useful to you. If you just want to make something bigger or smaller, this is very useful. And then you might just say 2. Now it's 2 by 2 by 2 instead of 1 by 1 by 1. Or you might want to scale just in one axis, like Z, which will be increasing or decreasing its size. Oh, now I've set the, in that axis, or in the X-axis, or in the Y-axis. We're making it wider or thinner, right? This can be a little bit tricky because it depends on how far your mouse pointer is from this little orange dot in the middle. And if you start with your mouse pointer right in the middle, you're going to have a bad time. You're going to have very little control over what it's doing. Same thing goes for rotation. You want to kind of start with your mouse pointer kind of a little bit further away from that. And I believe it's the center of the object, or maybe the origin of the object. Interesting thing is you can kind of loop across. You can keep on moving your mouse pointer and just kind of loop in the interface. Same with up and down. So we're not going to bother with that, but this piece of track is probably a bit too high. So for the moment, let's shrink it down in the Z-axis to, let's say, well, let's have a look. 0.2, does that kind of look okay? Might be a little bit thin. How about 0.3? That looks all right, but now it's above the plane. And I kind of want to move it back there. I'm going to cheat a little bit here, and what I'm going to do is I want to select, well, I want to go into edit mode. Didn't talk about that yet, did I? I'm going to select this face, and I actually want to, I totally skipped something which was like the most important thing. You kind of need to know where things are in the interface in order to be useful with Blender. But there are so many keyboard shortcuts and so many commands that it's almost impossible to know them all. And the thing is, if you have an idea of what it might be called, that's better than nothing. And the way to get around, if you do know that, is just to use the spacebar. That's the most important command. If you don't remember any other commands, just remember the spacebar. And this is the search functionality. So what I'm looking for at the moment is something around setting the origin to the bottom of the object. And you'll see why this is important. Set origin. Actually, I don't want to do this. Let's have a look for origin. Clear origin, set origin. Actually, I want the 3D cursor. You kind of have to do this in a couple of different steps. Cursor, snap cursor to active or to selected. Right, so what I'm going to do here, I think I'll just do it and then I'll explain why it's important. So I'm going to go into edit mode, which allows me to actually select different parts of the object, not just the whole object. It can either be vertices like this, or you can be in selecting edges like that, or selecting faces, right, like this. I want to put my 3D cursor and then my origin of the object on this face, right in the middle of it. So what I'm going to do is say cursor, snap cursor to selected. That's going to put the 3D cursor right in the middle of this face, which also happens to be the very bottom of the object. Right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the origin of this object to where the 3D cursor is. And these things can also be hierarchical menus. So origin to 3D cursor, right? Sugar. Okay, can't do it in edit mode. But it doesn't matter, the 3D cursor is not going anywhere. So set origin. Origin to 3D cursor. Right, now the origin of this object is no longer right in the middle of the object, but it's at the very bottom of the object. What does this mean? Well, I guess it means that I can now, well, probably for the purpose of what I'm about to do, it's not so important, but it actually, no, it is, sorry, it is important. So the location of the object up here in the top right, click on it a few times. This doesn't tell you, like, I mean, what does it mean for a 3D object and what is its location? You know, if you're standing in the doorway of a room, are you inside the room or are you inside the hallway or are you in the doorway? It's not so meaningful. So Blender basically represents the location of the object as actually where is the origin of this object. And confusingly, the origin can actually be outside of the object entirely, but that's a different story. So right now, we can see that it's at 0, 0, but 0.35. And that's the location of the origin point of this object. And to make this object sit nicely on the plane, I'm going to set this to 0. Great, it's perfectly on the bottom. So we've got something that could be a track, all right? And I'm going to actually also set this to be, let me see, -1? No, I'm going to set this to be -0.5 for reasons that will become clear later on. So we have something that could be a track. How can we actually turn this into a bit of a track? Well, what do we need? Let's have a look at our reference material. What does this actually look like? Am I going to get the right window up here? Let's try and bring it up. Okay, we've got a couple of grooves. And then we've got a couple of these funny little indentations. So we need to create all of these things. And I'm just going to use some very simple tools for doing this. One possibility would be, let's create a cube. Wow, it's huge. Let's make it a lot smaller, okay? Much smaller. Let's make it about the kind of cross-section of what the track might be. Now I'm just going to move things around a little bit. Is this overlapping? It is. Okay, let's scale this in the Y direction. And it scales from the origin point, which is another reason why the origin is kind of interesting. One thing we could do here is we could say, let's just kind of make an indentation inside of here. We could use some modifiers for that. One modifier we might use would be mirror. We could mirror it around the cube we already have in the x-axis, and then we've got two rails almost, which are the same distance apart from the center, which is quite convenient. And then we could make them kind of, we could make an indentation of that inside of the original object. So we could go over to this object, we could do this Boolean modifier, and we could say, take the difference of these two things with the cube. Now, it's not so obvious what's going on here until we get rid of the original one, and then we can actually see, oh, look. Let's move around a little bit. And in fact, at this point, we could just do a render and see what it's doing. Okay. Now, this is rendering what is enabled for render mode, and this is where these things become important. We've got little eyes over here on the right side that show you what's visible when you're editing, and the camera shows you what's visible when you're rendering. So if we turn that off and do another render, let's have a little zoom in there. We can see that it kind of looks, yeah, it kind of looks okay. It kind of looks like what we want. That's one way to do it. I'm going to come back to this though. I'm not going to do it that way. So let's get rid of this cube. Actually, we can't even see it. I hope, yeah, usually that means you can't delete it either. So let's delete that. So what's another way we could do this? Well, we can also do what's called a loop cut. I'm going to go into edit mode. I can't remember if you need to select everything for this. Okay. And we do Control R. And a loop cut is going to try and figure out automatically one unbroken path around your object entirely, and this can only be done really in these two planes. So it's going to try and do it in this plane, or if you move your cursor around, it can do it in this plane. So we want it in this plane, but we want it over to the left-hand side over here. So what we do is we just say yes. We click on this. We want it in that plane. Now we can kind of decide where it might go. And again, this is where the keyboard really helps you out. So I'm going to say 0.9, and this is just a ratio between 0 to 1 of how far over to one side you want it to be. So I'm going to say I want it around about there. I'm not actually sure if that's at all accurate, maybe 0.8. Let's try that. Okay, so now we've added some geometry. We've added some new vertices and some new edges. I'm going to do another loop cut. Now this is probably also going to look a little bit weird, and I want this to be 0.7? No, 0. Well, maybe this is going to get confusing. Well, what happens if we make 0.8 minus? Well, then we've got another cut, but on the opposite side. Okay, well let's try that. Let's make another loop cut, and then we're going to say 0. Well, let's say, yeah, 0.8 of this new face that we've got here. Let's see what happens there. Okay. And then we do it again. And 0.8, but on the opposite side. Okay, it's starting to look like something. We've got some lines over here. What can we actually do with this? Well, now we've got some additional geometry we can manipulate, like these faces. And what we can do is we can extrude these, which I remember is it E? Yes. This may not actually be the right way of doing this. But we'll try it anyway. So we can extrude either pulling it out further or pushing it back in. So let's see, we want to make it in the negative Z by about 0.1. That's too much. 0.3. You have to be careful. Look at what's going on down the bottom here. If you give it an incorrect floating point number, then it's going to get very confused. Something with two decimal points. You can basically type whatever you want, right? And it's just going to say this is invalid. Okay, minus 0.3, way too much. 0.05. That might be about enough. Let's do that to this one as well. So extrude minus 0.05. Okay, got something. This doesn't quite look right. What we can do is we can delete these faces. We've actually got, oh dear. I think this is the wrong way to do it entirely, actually. I think this is kind of, I might have been better served by actually doing the Boolean modifier like I did before. But anyway, we'll press on. I think, okay, let's press on. What we can do here is we can actually move this edge down. And this is where, well, what have we got here? Another face. It's kind of confusing. What's going on here? We've got several different faces which are sort of overlapping. I think it might be, is it this face? That one? We've got some stuff going on here that doesn't entirely make sense. I think what we should do is we should move this edge down and we'll turn on edge snapping. We can grab this. Wow, that is not going to work at all. I think we might actually be better off just cloning, just doing the Boolean modifier as I tried out earlier. So, good example of when you've got a lot of different tools at your disposal, and not all of them are going to work the way that you want. So, that's a little bit disappointing. I wanted to do that. Okay, so let's try that again. Edit mode, object. I'm going to go through this lightning fast. Conveniently created a cube, which is exactly what we wanted, and we're just going to put this in the same place again. And it's kind of hard to see what's going on here when you're in this view and you're not looking at it from the right side. And actually this needed to be a little bit, looked like it needed to be a little bit deeper of a cut than we had before. So again, you're going to scale in the Y direction. Move it over. And I'm afraid this is probably all going to look mostly the same when we start doing this for the other parts of the object. So we're not going to learn too many new things, I'm afraid. Alright, so we've got that mirrored. That's fine. Let's apply that, get rid of it. So this is now actually two real parts of this object rather than just one, which is created by the modifier. Now we've got the Boolean. Actually, we don't want the Boolean to be on here. We want the Boolean on here. Making this difference with that other cube. Again, just take another look. Just make sure it kind of looks about right. All right, let's do that. Let's apply it. And now we've made that permanent change in this cube. So we can get rid of the other one. X, delete. Okay, what are we going to do about the other part? So we need a little bit of a gap here and then a circular thing. So we're just going to do the same thing. And incidentally, we can choose where to create these objects by placing the 3D cursor. And we can make this a little bit more defined by just putting it exactly where we need it. It's not really that important. We can just move stuff around. But if you want to be printing out something that actually is the right shape, then you probably want to be careful with where you're placing your objects. So, first off, cylinder. Wow, this is way too big. Let's shrink the radius down of this. And the depth, we need the depth to go all the way through this object, so let's keep it to some reasonable amount. How big does this need to be? Well, if you were doing this properly, you probably want to make sure that the dimensions are right. Okay, I don't want to be scaling this. Getting a bit lost here. Okay, so, well, I've already lost the chance to set the initial settings, but we can scale this up. So I want to scale this in all dimensions except for the Z. So I can press Shift Z. And it locks the Z axis, but it keeps the other axes free to scale. So I'm scaling this in both X and Y at the same time. It's very useful. How big does this need to be? I don't know, about there, maybe. Let's try. And how far away from the edge does it need to be? Well, let's see. If you want to be exact about this, you can go into the orthographic view, and that could be a little bit more useful. Yeah, that looks about right. If you had some actual track, or you had like some, the best thing would be to have some actual dimensions for this stuff, and then you can measure it, set it in Blender units precisely, so that you're actually placing these things at the right size in the right place. So we're going to just do the same thing. Cube, Boolean. We're going to intersect it with the cylinder, difference. Let's go back to perspective view. If you've got a full-size keyboard, by the way, it's much easier because you can use all of the number pad shortcuts. Let's not look at that. Well, it's not too interesting at the moment. It punches its way through, but beyond that, yeah, more or less looks okay. All right, let's just do it. Apply. Get rid of the cylinder. Don't need it anymore. Okay, then we need the little bit that comes out from that circular part of it. Okay, we've got our good old cube again. So let's make this a little bit longer. And it also needs to punch all the way through. So scale in the Z-axis again. Oh, hang on. And yeah, we can just use the Z manipulator here. Okay. That's probably going to be about all right. So let's add the Boolean modifier again. Cube difference. You can obviously do a bunch of different things with this tool. And that's what it's going to look like roughly. That looks pretty good. Actually, you know what? I think that looks a little bit too narrow. I have a feeling these things are a little bit wider than that. So let's scale this X. How about that much? I think that looks about right. Maybe even a little bit more than that. But anyway, it's probably okay for the moment. Yeah, that'll do. Okay. So, apply that Boolean modifier and get rid of the cube. So, looks a little bit wonky, but I think that'll be okay. We could apply some bevels to the edges to make them a little bit smoother, but that's probably enough. So what does it look like? That looks okay, but I guess at this point we might want to actually, yeah, let's get a little bit of a better view of this object. It's a little bit too far away. So now it's time to maybe put our lighting in a slightly better place and put our camera in a slightly better place. So the camera is just another object. We can select that. Now something that's really useful for setting up your render, and by the way, we're just using the Blender render engine at the moment, which is the simpler one, but faster. We could be using cycles, but it involves setting up much more lighting and getting a lot more into this, how it works with materials and textures, etc., which is a little bit irrelevant. So what we're going to do here is go to the camera view, and a really useful thing to do here is to lock the camera to the view, which means we can move around using our regular kind of movement tools, and we basically drag the camera with us. So let's get a nice close-up of this camera. Of this track, rather. And you can see as soon as we disable that, well, our camera's right there. Extreme close-up of the piece of track. Let's render again. Yeah, there it is. Lighting's a little bit weird. Let's move the light. So we've got the lamp out here, which I think at the moment is just probably a sun lamp. Can you see? It's over here. It's a point lamp. What happens if we make it a sun lamp, which just kind of lights up the entire scene? Wow, that's pretty extreme. Let's maybe leave it as a point lamp. Maybe we can just move it into a slightly better place. I'm not going to get too hung up on this, because after all, we're not really about rendering, but we're going to turn this into something that we print. And then we've got, yeah, we can see the shadows, and you can see that it's 3D, etc., etc. It's probably a bit too thick, to be honest, but again, this is not really meant for just slotting in and using straight away. It's probably, all the dimensions are off, but we can just kind of see what's going on. Okay, so that's about right, I think. Final thing we can probably do with this is just, we could actually mirror this again and turn it into this two-ended thing that we were actually going for. Now the problem is here, we don't really have something to mirror it around. So what I'm going to do here, first, put my 3D cursor, if I can find it, right back in the very middle, because that's what we're going to mirror around, or that's what we want to mirror around, and we have to put something there to mirror around. I'm just going to put these plain axes empty object, which is not really anything, it's just kind of like a thing. It's an object that has a place, and you can kind of use this for grouping objects, but anyway. For the moment, we're just going to use this as a reference point to mirror this around. So we'll mirror around that empty. Now, it's currently mirroring in the x-axis, which of course is this red line, which has effectively doubled up the object, but you can't see it. But that's not the axis we want to mirror around. We actually want to mirror around the y-axis. So it's created this double-ended thing. Half of it doesn't really exist. It's been kind of created dynamically at runtime. So if we decide that we like this, then we click apply. And now it's actually part of the geometry. And again, we could just get rid of this empty now because it's done. What does the render look like? Well, we're kind of a little bit off now, but it doesn't really matter. We're not too interested in the render. We can move this, this camera back if we really wanted to, but probably not so important. Well, let's just take a look at it. Yeah, we're completely off. Okay, so we have this thing now. Let's look at my agenda again. So, to be honest, well, okay, let's just continue with the original plan. So let's bring back our little window here. We could get a texture and just see what it might look like in real life if we were to actually kind of print this out with some kind of a woody looking material. I guess it's all going to be plastic, but maybe you could at least get a wood color. So wood, unfinished wood. Do we have any decent textures here? Well, these are all pretty bland looking. Varnished wood. No, we don't want varnished wood. How about wooden boards? This looks about as close as I can think of to something that might actually be useful. So let's grab this one. All right, we've got that image there. Let's go back to Blender. And this object here. Actually, let's fix up the viewpoint of this camera because we're going to want to see what it actually looks like. So, lock the camera to the view. Okay, now we can actually see what it's going to look like. And we might also just add a plane, just so we've got a nice background that we can render it against. Okay, you can see what's going on here. Okay, so our cube, we need to give it a texture. And this one we can just give it, I guess, an image. Am I looking in the right place? Image here. And this is far simpler than if you're doing it in Blender Render. So, oh, we've actually got a wooden image there. Let's pick something here. And where do I load this? I haven't used this for a while. So, downloads, wood. Let's just try it and see what happens. Now we can get a preview here by going to the rendered view. Now it's all kind of messed up because this thing is actually, it doesn't really understand how to map this 2D texture image to this 3D surface. If you wanted to really get that looking better, you would need to do all this kind of stuff like UV mapping, but we're not going to get into that. But for the moment, that's pretty much okay. Solid. And we can render it again, and then we get this kind of funny looking thing all over the place. It's made its best effort to figure out how to map this texture to it, but you can see that it looks a little bit off. Got all these funny triangles going on in here. Inside of the slots, it's probably a complete mess, but that's okay. That's kind of what it might end up looking like, vaguely. So that's it, basically. We've got our little object there. If we wanted to print this out, we could go to export, and then we would want to export an STL file. And you might call this something like briotrack.stl. And you remember much earlier I said something about scale and how big this is going to turn out. Well, because we've been working in Blender units at a pretty small scale, this would end up being like 1 millimeter by, I guess, 2 millimeters. Let's go back and have a look. Cancel that. this basically, yeah, this would be like 1 millimeter on this side and 2 millimeters by that side. It's obviously way too small. And if we were to bring back up our Brio track here, this is obviously several centimeters. I don't know how big these things are, but probably I would say at least, what, 4 centimeters this way? And maybe this would be, I don't know, 10, 15 centimeters that way. So if we wanted to really do this, one way, if we were just unconcerned about the results, we might say, okay, scale this up. If it's 1 millimeter and it needs to be 4 centimeters, we need to scale it up by potentially 40 times, right? And we could do that. I have no idea what these other things are, but anyway. And if you were really going to do this and export as an STL, you also probably want to use selection only. So in this case, you select the cube and that's the only thing you want in this file, right? If you've got like some other, you don't want to print out this plane, for example, right? That's going to get a little bit expensive. So you only want to, if you only want to print out this one object, you only want to have that one thing selected, and then you select selection only. And then you can just save this STL file, take that to your 3D printer or 3D printing shop and see what comes out. So that's a real lightning kind of crash course in Blender. It's probably extremely confusing, and you can see that when we made that approach of trying to use the extrusion, there are a bunch of different ways, not all of which work. I'm sure there's a way of making that work that could have been a little bit more understandable, but we kind of got a little bit stuck with the additional faces, and it probably would have taken a little bit of time to kind of rescue ourselves out of that situation. So that's pretty much it. I hope that was useful to you, and enjoy using Blender.